Welcome. You're listening to This Leader, the podcast. If you lead people and are seeking the transformational, high-impact secrets that will lead to greater joy and fulfillment in your work, will optimize your team performance, and will help you create a happy, highly productive workplace, then you are this leader and you're in the right place. I'm your host, Claire Laughlin, and each week my guests and I will explore the mindsets, techniques, and actionable strategies that will help you build the career, team, and organization of your dreams. Because I believe no one should have to suffer in a dysfunctional workplace. Let's get started. I was sitting with a client recently, and we were looking through their engagement survey results. And as we dug in, I noticed something really confusing. We saw the same challenges, the same frustrations, the same points of friction showing up year after year after year, despite plenty of training and intervention, okay? And my client and I, we just sat there and we asked each other, okay, wait, what is really holding this organization back? I'll tell you, that question has fascinated me for as long as I can remember. Because when I step back and I look at patterns, right, in organizations, in teams, in individual leaders, and if I'm being honest, in myself, I keep seeing the same thing. For me, the one common denominator in all of my personal and professional setbacks is me. I mean, I learn and I grow and I work to advance myself continually, but there are just those sneaky, almost innocuous patterns that keep showing up. And darn it, I am so ready to resolve those issues once and for all, right? How about you? Today, my guest is Dr. Ryan Gottfredson, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, best-selling author of 3 books, including his newest, Becoming Better, The Groundbreaking Science of Personal Transformation. He's a professor of leadership at California State University Fullerton. He's a global authority on what's called vertical development and a consultant who's partnered with organizations like CVS Health, the Federal Reserve Bank, and Kaiser Permanente to help leaders make genuinely transformational, not just incremental, change. His research has been cited nearly 5,000 times since 2020 alone, and he has a TEDx talk on how to fix leadership development that I think every leader needs to watch. So here's exactly what drew me to Ryan's work. He is asking a different question than most leadership researchers. Not what do leaders need to do, but who do leaders need to be? He calls this the difference between your doing side and your being side. And once you see it, honestly, you cannot unsee it. What's more, he gives us an actionable pathway to being side growth, what he calls being side growth, which I love. And I'll be honest, I discovered Ryan recently, his work recently, and I've already read all 3 of his books. One of them, I'm just finishing up my 3rd time through. So today, I get to pull back the curtain with Ryan on the invisible operating system that's quietly driving your decisions, your reactions, and your leadership ceiling, and the real approach that you're going to need to upgrade it. So let's dive in. Here's my conversation with Dr. Ryan Gottfredson. Hi, Ryan. Thank you for being here.
Claire, it's so good to be here. I've been excited about this conversation. We connected a couple of weeks ago in preparation for this, and I've just been chomping on the bit.
Me too. Me too. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to dive right into the deep end of the pool because there's so many things I want to talk to you about. But I will say that since I became familiar with you just very recently, I have been reading your books nonstop. I've read one of them 2.5 times already. And your work really speaks to me because I feel like you're answering a question that has fascinated me for as long as I can remember. And it's like, why and how do we as fallible humans get in our own way so much? Why do we hold ourselves back, or how do we hold ourselves back? Both of those things have always fascinated me. So tell me about you.
Yeah. Here's the thing that I've learned is we are all holding ourselves back in some way.
Yeah.
And the question is, are you aware of how you're holding yourself back? And the reality is that most of us aren't, or else we would have already done something about it.
Right.
So, if it's okay, let me share a little bit of my own personal story. I'm going to come at this in a couple of different angles. I got my PhD in organizational behavior and human resources from Indiana University, and I studied leadership in pursuit of one, how can I become a better person and leader? But how can I also help others become better people and leaders? And so I'm in the thick in my doctoral program learning all about this. I become a professor at Cal State Fullerton. And I was there for 2 years, continuing to dive into research, teaching students. And I had this job opportunity pop up to work with Gallup. And I had always had this itch to do consulting. And I thought, let's do it. Like, let me take this leap, work at Gallup. So I left Cal State Fullerton, took a leave of absence, and I jumped over to Gallup. And I was almost thinking, this is like a complete career change for me. I was thinking I'm
Wow.
going all in on Gallup. And Gallup does employee engagement consulting. And I got in there and I quickly became a little bit disgruntled because they stuck me in a role that was much more narrow than what we had talked about through the interview process. And so I just struggled over the next 10 months trying to figure out how do I break out of this narrow role that they had me in. And I was continually kind of complaining to my manager about it. And one day something must have happened. I got on the phone with her and I was complaining to her. And she said, "Hey, Ryan, I'm going to stop you right there." I said, "Okay." She said, "This clearly isn't working out. I'm going to have to let you go." And I got fired. Like, I never thought I would get fired. And this waterfall of shame is washing over me. What am I going to tell my wife? What does this say about me as a person? What's my future going to look like? So I've got all these questions that are rolling around in my head. But one of the biggest questions that I struggled with was I knew I had the knowledge and skills to be successful, yet I wasn't. And so why? Why wasn't I? And that question has really led me on my journey that I've been on, now written 3 books that are kind of culminating after trying to answer this question. Why is it that we can have the knowledge and skills to be successful, yet we don't experience the success that we want? And I think that that's in a way, it's me trying to bring to light your question is why do we hold ourselves back? And so I feel like I've got some good answers, but before I deliver some of those answers, let me just pause there, see if you have any comments about this story and how I've set this up.
This is such a great story. Okay, 2 things come to mind. One is I just think so many people would walk out of that situation. I've just gotten fired, waterfall of shame. What do they do with it? They go, "It's your fault. Oh, I couldn't be successful there. I couldn't be because you didn't give me," you know what I mean? Like they'd point outwards and they'd look for who to blame outside of themselves. And I'm always fascinated with that because I think that the point of power is always inside, right? I'm always trying to talk about that with people like, look, you can spend a lot of time spinning out over what happened and who did what and why they didn't and what they should have done differently, but you don't have any control over any of that. So that's one thing. And I think we should kind of head down that path. But in addition, I think, do you think it takes some kind of a bottoming out type of experience, whatever that might mean for the individual, to have this kind of awakening? So we can go down both those paths.
So to me, what I've learned is, and I wasn't aware that there was a direction that I could focus at that time that would lead to a solution. I wasn't aware of that. And now I feel like I've got that. Here's the way that I like to articulate it is we have 2 different sides of ourselves. We've got what I call our doing side. Think about a horizontal axis. This is our level of talent, knowledge, skills, and abilities. So I felt like I had the doing side, right? I've got a PhD in this stuff. I was one of a few who had a PhD at Gallup within that consulting arm. So I felt like I had that. But what I was lacking in that I wasn't aware of was a different side of myself. It's what I call our being side. And our being side is the quality and sophistication of our body's internal operating system. And so when we talk about our character, our mindsets, our psyche, our emotional regulation abilities, that's aligned with our being side. And so to your point is I think when we get into these situations where we feel stuck, we feel stagnant, we have a tendency, to your point, is blame the external environment, or we look to solutions with improving our knowledge and skills. But what I find, particularly with leaders, almost all leaders that I work with, they have enough knowledge and skills to be successful. If there's something that's holding them back, and what was holding me back in this situation, it was all about my being side. And the quality of my mindsets, my psyche, my emotional regulation abilities, my emotional intelligence wasn't where it needed to be. And once I realized that now this became a new developmental pathway that I had never been introduced to, is the being side. Because everything that I'd kind of been taught, my education systems, athletic programs, most organizational development efforts says, if you are stuck, gain more knowledge or more skills. But what I find for leaders, that is rarely the solution.
Right. I love that you said that part of what unlocked this was you didn't know prior to this experience or to these sort of pathways opening, like you may have had ideas like, okay, maybe I'm part of the problem here, right? We've all had those moments of like, the one constant factor here is me, but we don't know how. We don't know how to go from where we are to the next thing. And so often, that's exactly right. I feel like that so resonates that where is our character development and our emotional intelligence training and the training on thinking about our thinking and things like that. And, some sort of traditions have it, like Montessori, I think, is a place that tends to have more of that in their educational system. But most of us, the vast majority of us may stumble on that by accident, but otherwise, where are we getting it? I mean, if you're part of a religious community of some sort, or I think it has a lot to do maybe with the communities you're part of, but I love that you found it.
Yeah, not many. I would even say my experience with most religions is the teachings in the religion are very much pointed towards the being side, but the execution is all focused on the doing side. And so I kind of even think with a lot of religions, there's a disconnect between like beliefs and practice in that regard.
Yes. Oh, we got to walk that line here for a minute. Beliefs and practice. But first, let's go back into this doing and being, the vertical and the horizontal development. I think that is so fascinating because I think you're right. Like so many approaches are just about, okay, so you were unsuccessful in this role. What can you do, Ryan? What can you do to be more successful next time? Would you have a different kind of a conversation with your manager at a different time or this or that? It's all about the tactics. So if you could go back to your previous self, how would you have guided you earlier on?
Great question. Let me tell you what ended up happening. So, what I decided to do, I decided to come back to Cal State Fullerton. So, I rejoined the faculty and I started to dive back into my research. And my research at the time, here was kind of my big research question. I left with my doctoral degree and doing my dissertation on leadership with an understanding that most leadership research focuses on what do leaders need to do to be effective. And that's a good question, and it's led to some really good answers. But it's always felt short-sighted to me because I think that a better question is not what do leaders need to do, but who do leaders need to be? And so I started to dive into this research question. How do I answer this question? Who do leaders need to be? And I kept stumbling upon a term across a variety of different literatures. And the term was mindsets. And I said, I'm going to open up the floodgates. I'm going to learn as much as I can about mindsets. And what I found across psychology, management, marketing, and education is that there are different types of mindset sets that are studied. The most well-known is fixed and growth mindsets. But there's others like closed and open, prevention, promotion, or inward and outward. So these are these 4 different sets of mindsets. And I was learning about these. And as I'm learning about them, I've come to learn that these represent continuums. On one side, we're more wired for self-protection in the short term. And on the other side, more wired for value creation in the long. So for example, with a fixed and growth mindset, when I have a fixed mindset, my body is wired to avoid failure in the short term.
Yes.
Because who likes to experience failure, right? It's uncomfortable. It may say something about us. So a fixed mindset when we're wired to avoid failure in the short term. A growth mindset is when our body has the capacity to actually step into learning zone challenges that are ripe for failure in pursuit of learning and growing. So they're less concerned about failing in the short term, and they're more concerned about learning and growing and value creating in the long term. So hopefully that's just a quick kind of way to describe this self-protection to value creation. And so what I had learned diving into these is at first I was like, oh yeah, I have the value creating mindsets for sure, right? That was my thoughts. And then as I start to learn about them, I start to realize I don't think I have any of these value creating mindsets. In fact, I came to learn that I had more of a fixed mindset, closed mindset, prevention mindset, and inward mindset. And that was my answer to the question that I posed to myself after I got fired. Why was it that I had the knowledge and skills to be successful, but still wasn't successful? It's because my mindsets were shit. I had just had carried along some wiring in my programming that came out of my childhood. So, right, the wiring that I needed to survive my childhood, I was coming to learn was not the same wiring I needed to thrive as an adult, as a leader, as an employee, as a parent, etc. And so I had just learned by focusing on mindsets, that was one way that I was able to inspect the quality of my being side. And I just found that if we think about our being side being vertical, then, my altitude wasn't where it needed to be.
Yeah. I love how you talk in your book and Becoming Better about there being a center of gravity, or maybe that was in one of the assessments I took. Your assessments are
Yeah.
awesome, by the way. I love them. I love those assessments.
Yeah, and the assessments that we have, I've got two major assessments. One is a personal mindset assessment, and the other is called a vertical development assessment. Some terminology: horizontal development is development that focuses on improving along our doing side. That's what we're primarily used to. When we improve along our being side, that's what's called vertical development. And so these two assessments, the mindset assessment and vertical development assessment, if you want to take them, they're free on my website, and they are designed to help you gauge your altitude along our being side. Now, what we've realized is both of these come from different theoretical views. So the mindset assessment clearly comes from the mindset literature, and we've already kind of introduced that. The vertical development assessment comes from a different theoretical perspective, and it comes from the field of developmental psychology. And developmental psychology is most well known for studying childhood development stages. And what's interesting is that the focus has been on childhood development because for the longest time, adult developments or developmental psychologists assumed that adults don't develop, that we stop developing once we enter adulthood. But what we've actually come to find out is that that's not the case. That in fact, in adulthood, we can develop. And in fact, there's three different developmental stages. Now, what's interesting about this is they've found is that while there are three different developmental stages, most adults don't develop in adulthood. So if we've got three stages, I'm just going to label them for now: level 1, level 2, level 3. 64% of adults never get into level 2 or level 3.
Wow.
Only 35% of adults get to level 2, and only 1% of adults get to level 3. And so this mindset or this vertical development assessment is designed to help you identify which of those three levels, what's your default level? Because the reality is if we were to, dive into this, we can shift across these different levels, at least temporarily. But there's generally kind of one level, which is our primary or default level, or our center of gravity, if you will. And that's what that vertical development assessment is focused on. So both of those assessments are ways for us to help us awaken to our being side altitude. And I just wish I had those, 10 years ago before I got fired, because I don't think I would have gotten fired.
Yeah, but then you wouldn't be here now either.
That's true.
So you might not have given these gifts to the world if you had stayed at Gallup. Okay, so let's talk about this. Is a shocking statistic to me that so many people don't evolve out of that mind 1.0, I think is kind of what you call it, right? Is the vertical development. I don't understand that. And I just wonder, why is that?
Yeah, so you use the terminology that I use in my books, Mind 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0, to represent these three levels. And the reason why I use this terminology is because, like, when we go from one level to the next, there's an upgrade, like a 1.0 to a 2.0, right? So there's an upgrade that occurs. And the upgrade, there's different ways we could kind of categorize this upgrade. But at the basic level, when we go from one level to the next, there's a dramatic shift in the needs our bodies are wired to fulfill. So when we are in mind 1.0, and this is where most adults operate, our bodies are wired for safety, comfort, and belonging. And when we have these needs, then we're going to be fearful of certain things that go against these needs. So we're going to be afraid of discomfort, being uncomfortable, and not belonging, right? Does that sound like most people to you?
Absolutely. I would see those as very, like, just very core human needs.
Yeah.
It seems like we all have a need to belong. And, I guess, are you saying it's sort of a degree of how strong that pull is opposed to the pull of, say, 2.0 or 3.0?
Yeah. There's nothing wrong. Let's just be clear. There's nothing wrong with operating in mind 1.0, but there are limitations when we operate there because we have a tendency to hold ourselves back. We're not really willing to take risks, to take on learning zone challenges, to push against the status quo, right? Because all of that feels risky to us. And one of the things that happens here, right? You're stepping into this notion of belonging. There's nothing wrong with belonging, but let's point out that people can value themselves in different ways.
Yes.
A lot of people derive their sense of value based upon how much they feel like they belong to a group. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But I'm just going to suggest that's maybe not the best way to determine our value and our self worth.
Right.
And there's actually higher ordered ways of determining our value and our self worth. That the reality is our value and self worth should never be contingent upon the acceptance of others.
Right.
And that's when we're in this mind 1.0, our body does interpret our acceptance of others as a sign of our worth. I just think that that's just an immature view. It's not a fully incorrect view. I just think it's an immature view. And so that's kind of mind 1.0. Do you have any other comments there?
But let's go on.
Okay. So mind 1.0 are wired for safety, comfort, and belonging. We know when we've gotten to mind 2.0 when our needs change. And at mind 2.0, our needs become to stand out, advance, and get ahead. In fact, here, we're willing to be unsafe, uncomfortable, and not belong in order to stand out, advance, and get ahead. So this is actually where we find most leaders. 85% of leaders get here. Well, why is that? Well, when we develop ourselves and we're willing to put aside our needs of safety, comfort, and belonging, we develop our own set of beliefs. We've now moved from a dependent thinker to an independent thinker. And when we're an independent thinker, we want to run with our ideas. And what's the best way to do that? To get into a leadership role. So this is where most leaders, 85% of leaders, operate in Mind 2.0. Any questions or comments there before we go on to Mind 3.0?
No, I mean, it makes a lot of sense that that's where leaders tend to gravitate. There's a preponderance of leaders in that area because it's what we sort of need and assume leadership. It's what we need and what leadership kind of is in a sense. I guess part of that 2.0 thing, like to stand out is, I don't know why, but I think, oh, I don't want to stand out. Like, I don't want to stand out. I want to get ahead, but I want to stand out. I want to get ahead of where I was. There's some comparative thing there.
Yeah, some of those terms will resonate more with others, with some more than others. But at this Mind 2.0 level, as leaders, they're wired to focus on short-term results. And they derive their value by that. So now their value isn't derived by how well they're accepted. Their value is now derived on, are they meeting the expectations of their stakeholders?
Okay, that's good. That makes a big difference.
So that's Mind 2.0. So Mind 1.0, we've got our bodies are wired for short-term self-protection. And Mind 2.0, our bodies are wired for short-term results. And then at Mind 3.0, again, there's a dramatic shift in our needs. We're not focused on standing in and we're not focused on standing out. We're focused on contributing, adding value, and lifting others. So this is no longer about short-term results. It's about long-term purpose and it's about impact. So this is where our bodies are wired, not focused on ourselves, but on something bigger than ourselves. And when you think about, stereotypical great leaders, right? Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Abraham Lincoln, right? A lot of these are civil rights leaders because they don't have any sort of formal authority in most instances, yet they have been incredibly impactful, not because they want to be safe and not because they want some short, see me, let me stand out. It's because they're driven to have a purposeful long-term impact. And so as we go make these shifts, we kind of comment, we go from a dependent thinker to an independent thinker to an interdependent thinker. And now how we derive our value at this Mind 3.0 level is essentially by how much value are we creating for the people we serve.
I got a provocative question here because this came up for me when I was taking that assessment for you, right? I'm thinking about it and I'm thinking about how I have a real core belief that in business, we're both consultants, we're both entrepreneurs, we're out there making our way. And I just fundamentally believe that the best way to do that is to add value in the world. And yet there's this funny little loop that came up for me as I was taking the assessment and I was answering the questions. I was like, but what if when I'm adding value, it actually helps me, my own business, right? The more value I can add to the world, to my clients, then I do reap benefits from that. I feel better.
Which you should, and that's fine. That's just fine. But it's connecting to what is your motives? Is your motives more for others or is it more for you? And quite frankly, it could be the blend of the two. And that's in a way, right? We painted these three levels, and I tried my best to kind of paint them, try to find distinctions between them. The reality is just messier than that because I don't know about you, but I could see all three mind levels in myself. And so I love this framework because it gets us to ask and answer a question most people never even ask, which is, what is my vertical development altitude? And that's a really good question, and it leads to some really thought-provoking answers. But I don't know if it's even the best question to ask. I think another question to ask would be, what is my center of gravity? In other words, what percentage of my time do I spend at each of these levels? And so that makes us kind of think about vertical development in a slightly different way, which is vertical development is about upgrading our internal operating system so that we spend a greater percentage of our time focus on value creation as opposed to self-protection.
Yes, that's so good. And I think that's just it. And I love the idea of assessing, right? At the end of the day, your 5-minute journal exercise that you talk about. And it's like, okay, now that I understand a little bit more about my center of gravity, how do I elevate? And I'm guessing, like for me, I've been starting to think, okay, so this is a really good reflection at the end of the day. What thoughts did I have or what reactions did I have that were more in the self-protective kind of mode or in the sort of self-centered mode? I would call it that. You didn't call it that, but I was like, is it self-protective? Is it self-centered? Or is it other-centered and value creation? And trying to find those little moments when, oh, there I was. I got hooked into that self-protective mode. I could feel that in my body. I could feel my thoughts starting to spiral around specific things. And then just really sitting with that and trying to unpack it a little bit and figure, okay, I mean, in some ways I think, hey, there's that thought. Where did that come from? Why was that showing up for me? And also just looking ahead and thinking, how can I rewire and reorient myself so that the next time I get hooked in that same way, other thoughts are more available to me?
Let me try to put some language to exactly what you're saying. So I love everything that you're saying, and you're pointing out one of the keys of doing vertical development work, being side development work, which is really is all about self-awareness and becoming aware of how our body is programmed. Now, what I've kind of come to learn is there's kind of three different levels of being side development work that we could do. I call them surface level, deeper level, and deepest level. So surface level are things like journaling, meditation, yoga, even cold plunging is seen as with the surface level. And that's because these activities are things anybody could do. And the purpose of doing them isn't to learn more. It isn't to gain new skills. It's to refine our body's nervous system, to better increase our capacity to stay regulated and grounded amongst stress, pressure, uncertainty, and complexity. And so those are the surface level activities. I kind of say surface level or starter level being site development efforts. I think it's a good place to start, but where we want to get into, and you had mentioned this in your comments, is the next level down, this deeper level, we want to start to become aware of the programming baked into our internal operating system. Mindsets is the primary way that I use to help leaders awaken to their programming. But we can create if-then statements. So, for example, if somebody gives you constructive criticism, then how does your body typically respond? Does it get defensive or does it create space? And if it gets defensive, then it's like, oh, that's some programming I probably need to change or I need to upgrade. Or we could do, if I get cut off on the freeway, then how does my body respond? What we're doing is we're awakening to our body's non-conscious automatic processing. In fact, 95% of our thinking, feeling, judging, and acting is driven by our non-conscious automatic processing, or by our internal operating system. So at the deeper level, we are identifying specific programs in our body that are holding us back. And then when we identify those, then we can work on them. So that's the deeper level. Let me paint my own journey onto this. You had brought this up earlier. When I came back to Cal State Fullerton after getting fired from Gallup, I was affiliated with the center, and we went around meeting business owners in the local community. And I met this guy, his name's Charles Antis, really charismatic leader. And almost upon meeting him, he says, I've got a book that will change your life. And I said, awesome, I love books. And he comes around the corner with this book, the 5-Minute Journal, and he says, here it is. It'll change your life. And inwardly or outwardly, I'm like, oh, thank you. I love books. Inwardly, I'm thinking, who the hell do you think I am? There is no way I'm going to journal. And so anyways, I came home and I went to throw it in this trash. And I had this almost like spiritual epiphany where I saw his face in my mind's eye. And I heard him say the words, this book will change your life. And so I reel it back in and I open it up and, come to find out it's every morning, read an inspirational quote and then write down 3 things I'm grateful for, 3 things that would make today great, and then a couple of self-affirmations. And I said, oh, I'm going to do this. I'll give it a shot. I'll do it for 2 weeks. If I feel a shift, I'll keep doing it. If not, it's going in the trash. Well, I've been doing this for the last 8 years. So that helped me a lot, and it still does. So that's kind of surface level. And then as I started to get into the mindset material, I focused on mindsets and developing my mindsets. That was my primary focus for about 4 years. And I felt after the end of those 4 years, I had grown more in those 4 years than I had in the prior 15 years together.
Wow.
Like I took my development work to a deeper level and I just felt like I was a very changed person. I went from Mind 1.0 to Mind 2.0.
Okay, just give me some examples of that. Like, how do you catch yourself in that more self-protective set of mindsets and make the shift? Give me an example.
Well, so what we got to know about our mindsets and our mindsets in our brain, we all have, for example, a fixed mindset neuroconnection and a growth mindset neuroconnection. And we have both. One of those is generally stronger than the other. The one that's stronger, that becomes the default mode of our processing. So if I have a fixed mindset is really strong, that doesn't mean that I can't turn on a growth mindset. I can, and we all do at times. But what I found, for example, is that 60% of leaders have more of a fixed mindset than a growth mindset.
How?
Most leaders are wired to avoid failure and looking bad. And there's a lot of pressure to do that. So what I find, most leaders have more of a fixed mindset. If we want to develop more of a growth mindset, we've got to recognize that our neural connections are a lot like muscles. The more we use them, the stronger they become. And so we've got to engage in activities to regularly activate our value-creating mindset neural connection. And research has found is like videos, journaling, reading books, having discussions with others, working on our self-talk are types of activities that if we can engage in these about, I generally say 4 days a week, 10 minutes a day. If we could do that for 30 days, we're going to see a significant shift in how we process our world. And so that was what kind of I did for 4 years. I kind of went almost one mindset at a time. I'm going to work on fixed to growth. And so I'm going to activate those growth mindset neural connections. Then I went close to open, prevention to promotion. So that was, my focus for 4 years doing that.
So when you say like books and videos and podcasts, what you're doing essentially is that you're feeding yourself, you're nourishing those open and growth mindsets and the promotion mindsets. You're nourishing that as opposed to spending that same time nourishing the other, in a sense, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, there is learning and growth that occur, right? That's doing side, like I'm gaining knowledge. But let me give you an example of one of the books that I felt was game changing at the time. And it's this book. It's called You're a Badass by Jensen Hill. What it helped me to realize is I kind of carried around a deficit mindset. And this was ingrained in me and how I was raised was the idea of how you grow wealth is by saving as much of your pie as possible. And that was my mindset. And so I was very risk averse. I don't want to be an entrepreneur. I don't want to invest in a business because you don't know if you're going to get a return. And then Jen Sincero helped me to realize it's not about saving as much of a fixed pie. It's actually better to have a small piece of a large pie than a big piece of a small pie.
Okay.
And so now I'm thinking, how do I grow my pie? So my mindset shifted from how do I save as much as I can, essentially within my playing field, to how do I grow my pie? And that just opened up a completely different world for me. So yeah, I did learn about these kind of different mindsets, but it was actually activating that new worldview of how do I grow my pie and the challenge of doing that, that then led me to start my business. I had to go into debt to do so. And then that's ultimately, I credit kind of these two books, 5 Minute Journal and You Were a Badass, to get me to kind of start writing books.
Yeah, that's so great. We haven't done the 3.0, so we have to come back to that.
Well, yeah, the deepest level.
Let's do that next.
As I said, I kind of did this mindset work for about 4 years. It was where my primary focus was. And about that time, I came across a book because I'm trying to dive into the research, really the neuroscience on why do we have the mindsets that we do. And so I'm reading all of these different neuroscience books, and I came across a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And at the time I picked up the book, if you would have asked me, do I have trauma in my past? I would have said no. And as I'm reading the book, he's describing all of the typical impacts of trauma on how one thinks and how they operate. And I'm like, that's me. That's me. I'm like, oh my goodness. Like, do I got trauma in my past? And he kind of walked through different therapy modalities at the end of his book. And he talked about one that really intrigued me. It's called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. I was like, I've never heard of this before. And it sounds kind of hocus pocus. Like you just kind of get these bilateral stimulations. And for some reason, you can now kind of process through your trauma. So I was like, I want to try it out. But I still wasn't willing to admit that I had trauma in my past. So I called up a local therapist who specializes in EMDR. And I called her up and I was like, pretty sure the first thing I said was, I don't have any trauma in my past, but can I do EMDR? I'm sure she was just laughing, right? And she's like, yeah, I could help you unlock, whatever blocks that you have that are holding you back. I was like, all right, let's do it. So anyways, then that opened the door for me to do about 3 years of trauma therapy with this therapist. And that gets us to the deepest level where we generally need some sort of professional support. Usually it comes in a form of therapy. So it could be a psychological therapy, trauma therapy. I even have done some neurofeedback therapy. And there's also research on psychedelic assisted therapy. These aren't the places to start, but I think if we ultimately really want to elevate along our being side, we've got to get there. Essentially, let's say I did 4 years of mindset work and then 4 years of trauma therapy. And I felt that I grew in those 4 years doing trauma therapy more in those 4 years than I had in the prior 20 years combined. I just kind of felt like my rate of personal growth and development kind of was going at this exponential level. And I've kind of felt that way doing that work. And let me give you my biggest lesson that I've learned through this, which is doing vertical development work, being side development work at its very core is about healing our minds, our bodies, and our hearts. And to the degree that we do that is the degree that we could show up as a better fill in the blank person, leader, parent, spouse, whatever it is. Because when we're healing ourselves, we're upgrading our internal operating system. So we're less self-protective and we're more value creating.
I think that is so, so, so important. I want to make a leap here to something I just read in one of your newsletters. that you're calling fifth and sixth gear leadership. Why don't you tell us about this fifth and sixth gear idea? Is that okay?
Yeah, the idea of these gears really is based upon the Mind 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. Claire, I don't know if you've ever driven manual transmission car, but these days, if you're driving a nice fancy sports car, you're going to have 6 gears in the car. And what I find is that most leaders are driving in fifth gear. 85% of leaders drive in fifth gear. And fifth gear is great in the sense that you can go really fast in fifth gear. And it's kind of fun to drive in fifth gear really fast because you can kind of feel the speed. Because what's going on in fifth gear is the RPMs are quite high. And I've just learned this is where most leaders operate: high speed, high RPMs. And what's interesting is their belief that they carry operating in this gear. Of course, they don't want to be in this gear forever. It's unsustainable. And their belief is the way to get out of this gear is to push harder.
Right.
And I've learned that that is just completely incorrect because that only leads to more burnout. But there's this idea that, and most leaders aren't even aware of it, you can shift out of fifth gear and you could go into sixth gear. And getting into sixth gear is transformational because what happens is you could actually go faster in sixth gear, but you can do it at lower RPMs.
Yeah.
And so here's the thing about this that's so scary for leaders. And what holds them back from going from fifth gear to sixth gear is if you're shifting gears in a car, the first step in shifting gears is you take your foot off of the gas. And the fear for a lot of leaders is if I take my foot off of the gas, everybody will blow past me. And they might temporarily, because we got to pull our foot off of the gas. We got to stick in our clutch. And that's kind of the investigating of our internal operating system. And then we need to shift into sixth gear. And if we could get into sixth gear, then ultimately in the long run, we're going to go blow past everybody else who's stuck in fifth gear. But making that shift is easier said than done because one, nobody likes to take their foot off the gas. And two, I just have learned most leaders don't even know that there's a sixth gear. In fact, that was kind of me a few months ago. So I don't have this fancy sports car yet. That's my dream, right? But my first car was a manual transmission 1984 Mazda RX-7. It was just like this little speed demon. And I loved it. It was great, but it had only 5 gears. And so when I first created kind of this terminology, I first started calling it fifth gear leadership. And then I had a friend and she owns a Porsche and she's just like, "Do you realize there's 6 gears?" I was like, "I didn't even realize it." And so I think that that's kind of where most leaders are at in fifth gear. So when I work with leaders on this, they most commonly tell me, "I have never worked with a sixth gear leader." And it doesn't surprise me. I mean, only 8% of leaders operate in sixth gear. And so most leaders just kind of do what they've seen others do, and that's operate in fifth gear. And so I kind of feel like I'm on a mission to introduce sixth gear to leaders.
Yeah, I love that. So let's talk about that. Fifth gear looks and feels like urgency,
Control.
pushing.
Let's go harder. Let's go faster. Let's not make any mistakes. Let's not fail. We've got to execute, execute, execute.
Yeah. I always think about this team I worked with at one time, and I am not exaggerating when I tell you that when we started working together, they had a list of 167 priorities for their organization.
Wow, that beats the biggest list that I've seen. I've seen 131, and I thought that was big. So, oh.
And they were curious as to why they weren't making progress, right? And so I think about this as leadership driving their entire organization in fifth gear. Everything is urgent. Everything is an emergency.
Yeah, they almost identify with being firefighters. I've had executives team say, "I'm the best firefighter around." I'm like, is that something to be proud of?
Well, the thing is that in so many teams I've worked with and so many leaders I've worked with, when you suggest this idea that they need to take your foot off the gas and push in the clutch for a minute, I don't know what to me it looks like. And when it's happened to me, it feels like this tremendous fear. What will I miss out on? Will I get behind? Will I lose everything I've worked so hard for if I do that? It's like cliff diving. I am diving into the unknown here. I don't know what is going to happen next.
You're nailing something that's vital to understand about this being side development, which is the thing that holds us back. And this is where we started. The thing that always holds us back, and it's baked into our wiring, are fears and insecurities. It's a fear, you know, I might fail. I might let somebody down. And those fears are ultimately what hold us back. And if we aren't aware of what our fears are, they will continue to run our show. And so we've got to become the master, right? It's not like the fears fully go away, but when the fears are running the show, effectively, we're in the passenger seat and we need to get ourselves in the driver's seat.
I love that. Let's just talk for a second about what is sixth gear for those people who are willing to take that foot off the gas, push in the clutch, and hit sixth gear. What does that look like?
Yeah, primarily they are purpose focused. It is about creating value for something bigger than themselves. And they don't judge success by any short term wins or losses. It's about long term value creation. So they recognize there's going to be bumps in the road and they're okay with that. In fact, one of the things that we find is that fifth gear leaders, their primary kind of like terminology is results and outcomes.
Right.
For sixth gear leaders, their primary terminology is actually learning and mastery because that sets them up for long-term success. And in fact, they kind of recognize with these sixth gear leaders, there's a window of tolerance, a wider window of tolerance for failure and problems to occur.
Yeah.
Because they recognize that if they're going to push the limits in learning and growing, failure and problems are an inevitable part of the process.
Right.
And so they're not driven by a need to not fail because they don't see failure as an indictment against them. They see failure as a signal that we are moving forward, that we're making progress. And that's just unique. We don't see a lot of leaders like that. Like, let me give you an example. And I love this book. To me, this is a must read for any executive. It's Hit Refresh by Satya Nadella, who I think is a sixth gear leader. And he's got this really great story pretty early on in his tenure. And we can now kind of look back on it. I think this was 2017. And we can almost look back on it and laugh a little bit. But at the time, Microsoft was on the cutting edge of AI development and these bots that you can interact with. And they released a bot at the time that was called Tay. And it kind of interacted with Twitter. And so they released it out to the public and they essentially said, come interact with Tay and Tay will like respond to your questions. Well, they were maybe a little bit too trusting of the internet community because they started to like tell it like swear words, misogynistic language, and even anti-Semitic like languaging. And it started to spit it back out. And at that time, this was a huge red flag because everybody's kind of got this question mark. I mean, we still do to a certain degree of AI is dangerous. And this was proof of that, right?
Yeah.
So this was a huge blow, not only to Microsoft, but to the entire AI world. And Satya Nadella, right, he's fairly new in his role. The person that he took over for was Steve Ballmer. Steve Ballmer's a bit of a hot shot and a hard case. I just kind of imagine Steve Ballmer probably would have kind of laid the axe down here. And that's not what Satya Nadella did. In fact, Satya Nadella didn't even call him up. Maybe he should have, but he sent a note and said, thank you for your great work. Keep at it and know that I am with you.
Wow.
And it's like, he's got this window of tolerance. Like, yeah, it hit the fan today. But that's going to happen when we are on the cutting edge of a technology that can be world changing. We see at the end of the day, it wasn't that big of a deal, but they probably had to learn that lesson because now they can make adjustments to that bot or whatever that leads to now I interact with ChatGPT all the time. And quite frankly, ChatGPT thinks I'm the coolest person in the world.
You know, somebody was going to make that mistake. So,
Yeah.
Ryan, this has been so profound. I probably have 100 more questions, but I think you have given us really, really wonderful food for thought. I know I've learned things in this conversation that are really pivotal for me. And I know that's true for all of our listeners as well. So tell me one last thing, Ryan, before we close up here today, and what's on your horizon?
Let me tell you two things. So one of the things that I've learned, just to kind of summarize everything that we just talked about, is our being side altitude sets the ceiling for the groups and the organizations that we lead. If we want to elevate our group or organization, we've got to elevate ourselves. And so what I hope we've done in this conversation is we have opened up a new developmental door and strategy to step through. That it's not about gaining new knowledge and skills. It's about your next challenge is to upgrade your internal operating system. And hopefully we've given you, one, at least knowledge of the door, and two, at least some resources to turn to. We've given you assessments, books, articles, resources. But of course, if Claire and I could help and support any of you listening and doing some deeper work here, we would love to do so.
Oh, that is so fantastic. Thank you so much, Ryan. And where can people find you and these wonderful assessments and your books?
Yeah, website, ryangottfredson.com. Also, any social media, but I'm most active on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn. Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Ryan. Really appreciate your time.
Oh, thanks for having me.
When Ryan and I sat down for this conversation, I told him that the question of why we hold ourselves back has fascinated me for as long as I can remember. And what he gave me today was something I didn't expect. Not just an answer to that question, but a new and inviting door to walk through with plenty of exploration on the other side. And here's the thing that keeps echoing for me, honestly. So many of us have been driving in fifth gear to advance ourselves. High speed, high RPMs, convinced that the way forward is to push harder. I shared a story today about a team I once worked with who had 167 priorities. And they genuinely couldn't understand why they weren't making progress. That, my friends, is fifth gear leadership at scale. And what Ryan helped me see is that the shift into sixth gear, it certainly is not about doing more. It's honestly about taking your foot off the gas long enough to examine what's actually running the show, which, if we're being honest, 95% of the time is your non-conscious programming, like your operating system, not your intentions, and not your skills. I love what he said near the end. He said, our being side altitude sets the ceiling for the groups and organizations that we lead. So think about that. If we really want to elevate our teams and our organizations, we need to elevate ourselves along our being side first. And that work, the real work, it isn't about gaining new knowledge or skills. It's about healing our minds, our bodies, our hearts, and upgrading the internal operating system that's been quietly driving our behavior since childhood. I'm so grateful to Ryan for the depth and honesty he brought to this conversation. I mean, it was a joy to talk to him, and his willingness to share his own vulnerable moments, right? Getting fired, his own shame spiral, his therapy journey. That kind of vulnerability, my friends, it's rare, and it's exactly what makes his work so relatable and so trustworthy. You can find Ryan's free assessments, all 3 of his books, and his weekly newsletter at ryangottfredson.com. And I'd start with the personal mindset assessment. It's a genuinely eye-opening place to begin. So here's what I want you to sit with this week. Ask yourself, really ask yourself, are your fears running the show? And are you ready to focus instead on how to add more value? Because as Ryan said today, those fears don't fully go away. But when we're not aware of them, they will continue to run our lives. If this conversation sparks something for you, share it with a leader in your world who's been stuck in fifth gear and doesn't yet know how to get to sixth. And make sure you follow the show on Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star review so you don't miss what's coming next. Until then, keep leading the way.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode. To learn more about my services and for lots of free resources and additional tools to enrich your journey, visit my website and subscribe to my newsletter at clairelaughlin.com. If you have a question about leadership, teams, or organizational culture you'd like me to address on the podcast, please reach out to me at support@clairelaughlin.com and connect with me on social channels at Claire Laughlin Consulting. Until next time, lead the way.